In this session, we're going to be talking about validation rules. Specifically, this is going to be the introduction session, and we will review what validation rules are. So it says validation rules allow you to set up specific criteria to prevent users from saving invalid data in one or more fields. So let's say you want to have specific value in a field. Then in that scenario, what you can do is you can write a validation rule and prevent user from entering invalid values. All right. Validation rule evaluates a formula before a record is saved. If a rule's criteria aren't met, users see a custom error message and the record does not save. So let's say if the user enters bad data into the field, instead of entering valid phone number, if they enter some random text, for example, then they will not be able to save the record. When they click on the save button, they will see a custom error message that we want to be displayed for them. Next, we have how do validation rules work? A validation rule can contain a formula, just like the formulas we used in formula field expressions. And when they evaluate the data in one or more fields and returns a value of true or false. So the formula expressions that we're going to use in validation rules, they will get evaluated, and whenever they return true, the validation rules will fire. But if they return false, then the validation rules will not fire. So we're going to be talking a lot about those when we start actually writing the validation rule. So previously we said that, okay, validation rules block users from entering bad data, but there are some scenarios where validation rules will be ignored. For example, when you change ownership of records, let's say you have hundreds of records that are belonging to user A, and let's say the user A decides to leave the company. Now you want to or need to transfer all the records that which belonged to the previous user to a new user. For that, we have this mass transfer tool in Salesforce. And if you mass transfer their records to another user, then the validation rules will be bypassed. Also, if a record is being updated using a scheduled action in Process Builder, then it's ignored too. Campaigns are being associated with each other to build a campaign hierarchy, so their validation rules get ignored too. Field updates caused by workflow rules do not cause validation rules to fire. Also, validation rules can be ignored in a lead conversion. Sometimes when you convert a lead, they can be ignored if this checkbox is checked. Require validation rule for converted leads. If this is not checked, if this box is checked, then the validation rules will be reinforced. Okay. Then validation rules fire when records are being updated or created, but not when a record is being deleted. All right. So best practices is sometimes we will have scenarios, okay, if the case, if account is inactive, for example, then do not allow it to be associated with a case, or vice versa. A case cannot be associated with an account that is not active. There are two ways to do that, using a lookup filters or using validation rules. So in this type of scenarios, we will evaluate the situation, and based on that, we can also write lookup filters as well as create validation rules. In general, but not always, in general, if something can be done with lookup filters, then it will be done with lookup filters. If your purpose is to make a field required, consider making it required on page layout or lightning page. For example, if you want just one field to be always required and there's no other criteria, then you can simply make it required on the page layout or lightning page. We will still be making fields required in our validation rules, that's just because we want to practice them and we want to see how that works in validation rules. Another thing is to prevent reaching character limitation, it is recommended to use functions instead of operators. I'll go over this when we actually start writing a scenario, but we can also incorporate this type of operators or use functions. So whenever possible, we will use functions instead of these operators. There are 3 common ways to make a field required, for example. There are more than this, but these 3 are most common. We can make a field required on the field level. For example, when you create a field, a new field, you can mark it required during the creation, and in that scenario, it will be required universally. Right? It will be required universally. That's one way to do it. Another way, we can make it required on the page layout. You can open the page layout or go to the Lightning page and make it required there. All right. And also there is a option to make it required in validation rules. The difference making a field required in validation rule is that validation rules can make the field required based on specific criteria or conditions. Okay. But the other options, if you make a field required when you're creating the field, it will be required universally everywhere. You have to give a value to that field if you are updating or creating that record, right? But if you make it required on the page layout, it will be required only when the user is on that page layout. You can make it required on one page layout and not required on another page layout. And the validation rule can be, you can be more specific on the validation rules. You can put a lot of criterias and make it required only when those criterias are met. Right. So I want to give some heads up that when we are writing these validation rules, there will be some scenarios that where we will require creating custom fields sometimes. And then in that scenario, you will also need to be creating them, or you need to create them on your object so that you can follow along.